Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is the unfiltered truth from a child's mouth. When 8-year-old Valour walked into that glittering charity gala, he had no idea that his next few words would bring a billionaire empire crashing down. His mother had warned him to stay quiet, to be invisible like she'd learned to be. But children don't understand the politics of survival. They only know what's right and what's wrong. And what Valour was about to tell those cameras, what he was about to reveal to millions of viewers, would expose the ugliest secret hiding behind Seoul's most beloved philanthropist. This is the story of how one boy's innocent honesty became the sword that cut through years of carefully constructed lies. If you want to see how the powerful fall when the truth finally speaks, keep watching till the end, because this story will restore your faith in justice. The story begins Valour's mother, Cynthia, had come to South Korea 7 years ago with dreams folded neatly in her suitcase alongside her university degrees. She had a master's in business administration, spoke 4 languages fluently, and believed that the world would see her for her credentials. Seoul had seemed like a golden opportunity, a chance to build something meaningful. But dreams have a way of reshaping themselves when they meet reality, and reality for Cynthia came in the form of a job market that saw her skin before her skills. The rejection letters piled up. Interviews where she was clearly the most qualified candidate ended with polite smiles and promises of callbacks that never came. Her savings dwindled, and her small apartment in Itaewon grew colder as winter approached, and she rationed the heating. Then she met Mrs. Beatrice at a community center, another foreign woman who cleaned houses for wealthy families, who told her about a position with the Park family. The pay was exceptional, Mrs. Beatrice said, but there was a reason for that. The Park family lived in a compound in Gangnam that looked more like a fortress than a home. 3 stories of steel and glass, surrounded by manicured gardens. Park Jin-woo was the CEO of Daehan Tech Industries, a conglomerate that had made billions in semiconductors and artificial intelligence. His face smiled from billboards across Seoul, always photographed at some charity event or another, always with that practiced expression of benevolent concern for the less fortunate. Cynthia should have walked away when she saw the way Mrs. Park looked at her during the interview, the way her eyes traveled slowly from Cynthia's hair to her shoes, with undisguised disdain. She should have left when Park Jin-woo didn't even glance up from his phone while his wife listed the job requirements, treating Cynthia like a piece of furniture being delivered. But the salary they offered was 3 times what anyone else would pay, and Valour needed new shoes, needed better food, needed a chance at a good school. So Cynthia took the job, and with it, she swallowed her pride. The first week, Mrs. Park's mother, an elderly woman everyone called Halmoni Park, threw a cup of tea at Cynthia because it was too cold. The porcelain shattered against the Kit Beatrice wall, brown liquid dripping down the white tiles, and Halmoni Park simply walked away without a word while Cynthia cleaned it up. When Cynthia mentioned it to Mrs. Park, hoping for some acknowledgement, some apology, Mrs. Park had simply said, "My mother has high standards. Try to meet them." The Park children, 2 boys aged 12 and 14, treated Cynthia like she was invisible unless they needed something. They would drop their school bags in the middle of the hallway and expect her to move them. They left food half-eaten on plates scattered throughout their rooms. Once, the younger one, Minjun, had deliberately spilled juice on a floor Cynthia had just finished mopping, looked her directly in the eye and said, "Clean it again. That's what we pay you for." Park Jin-woo barely acknowledged her existence. To him, Cynthia was part of the house's machinery, something that should function smoothly without requiring his attention. The few times he did address her directly, it was to criticize. The dinner wasn't warm enough. The shirts weren't pressed correctly. She was walking too loudly on the second floor. Each complaint was delivered in a flat, cold tone that somehow hurt more than shouting would have. But Mrs. Park, she was the architect of Cynthia's daily humiliation, Mrs. Park, whose given name was Yoon Hee, but who insisted all the staff call her Madame, had perfected the art of cruelty disguised as standards. She would inspect Cynthia's cleaning with white gloves, literally, running her fingers along surfaces and holding up any trace of dust like evidence in a trial. She commented on Cynthia's appearance constantly, suggesting she was too tall, too dark, too noticeable. "Can't you make yourself smaller?" she once asked, as if Cynthia could physically shrink to make the family more comfortable. The worst part was the parties. The Park family hosted frequent gatherings, events where Seoul's elite came to see and be seen, and during these parties, Cynthia witnessed the transformation. Park Jin-woo became warm and generous, laughing loudly at jokes, his hand always on someone's shoulder in that performative gesture of intimacy. Mrs. Park glowed with practiced grace, complimenting other women's dresses while Cynthia knew she would later mock those same women in private. Even the children became model sons. Polite and respectful, nothing like the entitled tyrants who made the housekeepers' lives miserable. And through all of it, Cynthia smiled and served drinks and pretended she couldn't hear the occasional comment from guests. "So exotic to have African help," one woman had whispered loudly to her friend, "very cosmopolitan of the Parks." Cynthia had gripped the tray tighter and kept walking. Every evening, Cynthia came home to their small apartment where Valour waited, usually with Mrs. Kim from next door who watched him for a small fee. She would collapse onto their worn sofa, and Valour, beautiful Valour with his mother's eyes and his father's smile, a man who'd left before Valour could even remember him, would bring her tea and sit beside her, and she would tell him everything. Not because she meant to burden her 8-year-old son, but because holding it inside felt like swallowing poison. The words had to go somewhere. So she recounted her days, the small cruelties and large injustices, the way Halmoni Park had called her stupid for not understanding rapid Korean, the way Min Jun had laughed when she tripped carrying laundry, the way Park Jin-woo had docked her pay for breaking a glass even though his wife had startled her while she was washing it. Valour listened to all of it, his young face serious, his small hands sometimes reaching out to hold his mother's. "Why don't you leave, Mama?" he would ask, the same question every time, and Cynthia would give the same answer. "Because no one else will pay enough, my love. Because this job, terrible as it is, gives us what we need. It pays for your school, for this apartment, for food. Could we survive? But you're not happy. Happiness is a luxury, Valour. Survival comes first." Valour didn't fully understand, not really. How could he? He was 8 years old, still young enough to believe the world should be fair, that good people should be rewarded and bad people should face consequences. He didn't yet know that the world runs on different mathematics, that money and power create their own gravity, bending justice around them. But he understood that his mother hurt, and he hated the people who hurt her. Before we get to how Valour changed everything, hit that subscribe button because stories like this, stories about justice and truth, need to be shared, and we're just getting to the explosive part. Months passed in this routine of endurance. Cynthia became an expert at making herself small, at anticipating needs before they were spoken, at absorbing insults like a sponge absorbs water. She made friends among the other staff, women like her who had come from different countries seeking better lives and found themselves trapped in gilded cages of wealthy homes. They met sometimes on their days off, sharing stories and strategies for survival, creating small pockets of dignity in their undignified circumstances. One of these women, a Filipina named Maria who worked for another wealthy family, told Cynthia about the fundraiser. "Park is hosting something big," Maria said over coffee in a small cafe in Itaewon. "My employer was invited. It's for some new project, something about technology for underprivileged children." She laughed bitterly. "These people love helping poor children they'll never have to actually meet." Cynthia nodded, already dreading it. Big events meant weeks of preparation, meant longer hours, meant the Park family would be even more demanding than usual as they prepared to perform their public goodness. She was right. The fundraiser became the center of the Park household's universe for 3 weeks. Park Jin-woo was everywhere, unusual for him, micromanaging details and snapping at staff. This wasn't just another charity event, Cynthia realized. This was important to him in a way that went beyond performance. She overheard phone conversations about investors, about government officials who would attend, about media coverage. Whatever project he was unveiling, it needed to succeed. The event was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Grand Joseon Hotel, one of Seoul's most prestigious venues. Mrs. Park hired additional staff for the preparation, and the house filled with caterers, florists, and event planners. Cynthia found herself running errands at all hours, picking up forgotten items, delivering documents, coordinating between the house and the hotel. 3 days before the fundraiser, Mrs. Park called Cynthia into her sitting room. It was late afternoon, and the autumn light fell in cold slants through the windows. Mrs. Park sat at her vanity, applying cream to her face with methodical precision. "You'll need to be at the hotel on Saturday," Mrs. Park said without looking at Cynthia. "There will be last-minute issues that require attention. I need someone I can trust to handle problems discreetly." The word trust sounded strange coming from her, like she was speaking a foreign language. "You'll wear the black uniform, the formal one. Stay in the back areas. Some of our usual contacts will have questions, need things. You know how these events work." Cynthia did know. She would be invisible labor, making the event run smoothly while the Parks took credit for the flawless execution. "Yes, madame," she said. And Cynthia. Mrs. Park finally turned to look at her. "This event is extremely important to my husband's business. Nothing can go wrong. Do you understand?" "Yes, madame." "Good. You may go." The problem, of course, was Valour. Saturday was normally Cynthia's day with her son, their precious time together. Mrs. Kim could watch him. But the hotel was closer to their apartment than the Park house, and the event would run late into the night. After some consideration, Cynthia made a decision. She would bring Valour with her. She rationalized it easily enough. He was a quiet, well-behaved child. She could settle him in one of the hotel's back rooms with his books and tablet. She'd done it before at other events, though never one this large. He would be fine, and she would be able to check on him periodically. On Saturday evening, Cynthia dressed in her formal uniform, the black dress that Mrs. Park insisted all household staff wear for public events, and helped Valour into his best clothes. He had a nice button-down shirt, slightly too large, that Cynthia had bought on sale months ago for him to grow into. His pants were getting short, she noticed with a pang. He was growing so fast. "Remember the rules," she told him in their apartment, kneeling to his eye level. "You stay where I put you. You stay quiet. You don't talk to the guests. This is very important for Mama's job, do you understand?" Valour nodded solemnly. "I'll be good, Mama. I promise." The Grand Joseon Hotel rose like a glass monument in the center of Gangnam, its entrance already crowded with luxury cars when they arrived. Cynthia led Valour through the service entrance, navigating the back hallways she'd already memorized during her preparation visits. The hotel staff knew her by now, nodded as she passed. She settled Valour in a small office that had been designated for event staff, a quiet room away from the main ballroom. "I'll be back to check on you," she promised, setting out his books and making sure he had water and snacks. "If you need me, you ask one of the hotel staff in the black vests, okay? Don't wander." "Okay, Mama." But Valour was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds are curious creatures. For the first hour, he was good. He read his book, played a game on the tablet Cynthia had saved for months to buy him. But the walls of the small office began to feel close, and the sounds from the hallway, the bustle of an event in full swing, called to him. He stood at the office door and peered out. People rushed past in both directions, purposeful and busy. No one paid attention to one small boy. He took a step into the hallway, then another. He told himself he was just looking, that he'd go right back. The hallway led to a corridor that opened to a view of the main ballroom, and Valor pressed himself against the wall to watch. It was like something from a movie. Hundreds of people in expensive clothes, glittering under crystal chandeliers. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of food. A stage dominated one end of the room, currently empty but clearly prepared for speeches. He spotted his mother briefly, moving along the far wall, speaking into a phone. She looked small from this distance, swallowed by the grandeur of the space. Then she disappeared into the crowd, and Valor was about to turn back to his room when he saw Park Jin-woo. The CEO stood in the center of a group of men in suits, all of them laughing at something he'd said. His smile was wide and bright. He looked nothing like the cold, dismissive man his mother described, but Valor knew better. He knew that smile was a lie, that the warmth was performance. Anger, sudden and hot, flared in his chest. That man, that smiling man, made his mother cry. Valor turned away, heading back toward his room, but he took a wrong turn in the maze of hallways. Instead of the quiet corridor he'd come from, he found himself in a busier section where hotel staff coordinated with event organizers. And there, set up in a side room with the door open, was a news crew. Several men stood around camera equipment, checking lights and sound. One of them, a younger guy with friendly eyes, noticed Valor standing in the doorway looking lost. "Hey there, buddy," he said in Korean. "You okay? Are you looking for someone?" Valor's Korean was good, learned from school and the streets of Seoul. "I was just walking," he said. Another crew member, older, looked over. "Whose kid is this?" "My mom works here," Valor said, which was true enough, for the event. The men exchanged glances, the kind adults share when they're charmed by a child but not quite sure what to do. "Well, don't wander too far," the friendly one said. "It's a big hotel. Easy to get lost." "What are you doing?" Valor asked, his natural curiosity overcoming his shyness. "We're from KBS News," the friendly man explained. "We're covering the fundraiser. Mr. Park is announcing a big new initiative tonight. Very important stuff." "My mom works for Mr. Park," Valor said before he could stop himself. "Oh yeah?" The friendly man smiled. "Then you must know all about what a great guy he is. That's what we keep hearing. Real philanthropist." Something in those words? The casual assumption? In the easy praise for a man Valor knew was cruel, made his stomach twist. But he just nodded. The crew went back to their equipment checks, and Valor knew he should leave, should go back to his room like he'd promised his mother. But his feet seemed rooted to the spot. He watched them adjust cameras, test microphones, chat amongst themselves about the evening schedule. If you're wondering how this small moment becomes the earthquake that shakes everything, don't go anywhere, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next proves that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices. The lead reporter arrived then, a polished woman in a red dress who immediately began reviewing notes with the crew. She practiced her opening lines, speaking about Park Jin-woo's charitable legacy, about Daehantech Industries' commitment to social responsibility, about tonight's exciting announcement. The friendly crew member noticed Valour still standing there. "You really interested in this stuff, kid?" he asked, amused. "Want to see how television works?" Valor nodded eagerly. He'd never seen a real news setup before. The man waved him over, let him peek through the camera viewfinder, showed him the monitors displaying different angles. The other crew members tolerated this with good humor, clearly on a break before the main event started. "You know what would be cute?" one of them said suddenly. "We should get some man-on-the-street reactions, but like, from a kid's perspective. Something different for the website content." The reporter looked skeptical. We're supposed to cover the announcement. This is just for the online extras, the crew member insisted. Come on, it'll be adorable. Kid at a fancy fundraiser? What does he think about charity and helping people? It's gold. The reporter glanced at Valour. Whose child is he? His mom works for Park, the friendly crew member said. He's fine. Right, buddy? Want to answer a few questions on camera? Your friends will think it's so cool. Valour felt a thrill of excitement mixed with nervousness. He thought about his mother's warnings to stay quiet, to be invisible. But this seemed harmless enough. Just a few questions. And the men were so nice, treating him like he mattered, like his thoughts were worth hearing. When did adults ever do that? Okay, he said. They positioned him in the hallway, adjusted the lighting. And the reporter knelt to his height, her smile professional but not unkind. Okay, sweetheart, I'm just going to ask you a few questions. Just be natural, be yourself. Ready? Valour nodded. The camera's red light came on. So, the reporter began, you're here at this big fancy event tonight. Do you know what it's all about? It's a fundraiser, Valour said, remembering the word from his mother's conversations. Mr. Park is raising money for a project. That's right. And Mr. Park? He's a very generous man, isn't he? Doing all this to help people? This was the moment. Later, people would analyze this exact second, this pivot point where everything changed. Valour looked at the camera, at the reporter's expectant smile, and thought about his mother coming home exhausted every night. And he thought about the stories of thrown teacups and docked pay and deliberate cruelty. He thought about that word the reporter used, generous, and how wrong it was. No, Valour said simply. The reporter blinked. No. Mr. Park isn't generous, he's mean. A pause. The crew members exchanged glances. The reporter's professional smile wavered slightly, but she was trained for unexpected responses. Oh? What makes you say that, honey? And Valour, 8 years old and tired of swallowing truth to make room for lies, began to talk. He's mean to my mom. She works for him, in his house. And he's really mean to her. His whole family is mean to her. They yell at her and say she's stupid, even though she's really smart. She went to university and has degrees and everything. Mrs. Park threw tea at her once and made her clean it up. And their kids. They're really rude. They make messes on purpose just so she has to clean them again. And Mr. Park takes her money sometimes when she didn't even do anything wrong. The words poured out of him, months of absorbed pain converting to sentences. The reporter's eyes widened. One of the crew members made a motion to cut, but the friendly one, the one who'd invited Valour to speak, shook his head. Keep recording. And Mama cries sometimes when she comes home, Valour continued, his voice growing stronger, more passionate. She cries because they're so mean to her. But she can't leave because they pay a lot, and no one else will pay that much, she says. So she has to stay there, and let them be mean to her every day. Even the grandmother, the old lady, she's mean too. They all are. But then they pretend to be nice at parties so everyone thinks they're good people. But they're not good. They're really, really not good to my mom. The reporter had abandoned her script entirely now. What's your mother's name, sweetheart? Cynthia. She's really smart, but they treat her like she's not. Just because she's black, I think. They say things about how she looks. Mrs. Park is always saying things about her skin and her hair. His voice cracked slightly. My mom is beautiful, and they make her feel like she's not. Silence in the hallway. The camera kept recording. Valour looked directly into the lens, his eyes, his mother's eyes, bright with unshed tears and righteous anger. So I don't think Mr. Park should get to pretend he's helping people when he's so mean to the people who work for him. That's not fair. My mom says the world isn't fair, but it should be. It should be fair. The reporter opened her mouth, closed it, then managed. That's That's very honest of you. Thank you for talking with us. The camera's red light went off. The crew stood frozen, looking at each other with expressions that mixed shock with something else, something like excitement. They'd just captured something real, something explosive, and they all knew it. "Oh, buddy," the friendly crew member said softly. "You just said a lot." Valor felt suddenly nervous, realizing perhaps that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "Did I do something bad?" "No," the man said, and he sounded genuine. "No, kid. You did something really brave." Before anyone could say anything else, Valour heard his name being called. His mother's voice, sharp with worry. He turned and saw Cynthia hurrying down the hallway toward them, her face creased with concern. "Valor, I've been looking everywhere. You can't just—" She stopped, seeing the news crew, the cameras, her son standing in the middle of it all. "What's going on here?" The reporter stood, smoothing her dress. "Ma'am, is this your son?" "Yes." "What is he? Did he bother you?" "I'm so sorry. He was supposed to stay in the—" Cynthia's words tumbled over each other. "He didn't bother us," the friendly crew member interjected. "We invited him to answer a few questions." Cynthia's eyes went wide with alarm. "Questions? What questions? What did he say?" The crew exchanged uncomfortable glances. The reporter spoke carefully. He spoke about his experiences, about your employer." The blood drained from Cynthia's face. "Oh no. No, no, no. And what did you say, Valor? What did you tell them?" "I just told the truth, Mama," Valor said in a small voice, "about how they treat you." Cynthia looked like she might faint. She grabbed Valor's shoulders, then looked at the news crew with desperation. "Please, you can't air that. Please. I need this job. Whatever he said, he's just a child. He doesn't understand. Please don't use it." The reporter's expression softened with something like pity. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but—" "Please," Cynthia interrupted. "Please. Park Jin-woo he's powerful. If you air something like that, I'll lose my job. I'll be blacklisted. No one in Seoul will hire me. Please. I'm begging you." The crew looked genuinely uncomfortable now. The friendly member who'd started this whole thing looked particularly guilty. "We haven't decided what we're doing with the footage," he said. "Let's not panic yet." But Cynthia knew better. She'd lived in Seoul long enough to understand how news worked, how a story like this, David versus Goliath, the mistreated immigrant worker and the billionaire philanthropist, would be irresistible. She could see it in their eyes. They were going to use it. "Come on, Valour," she said quietly, taking his hand. "We need to go." She led him back through the hallways to the small office, her hand trembling in his. Once inside with the door closed, she sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. "I'm sorry, Mama," Valor whispered. "I didn't mean to make trouble." Cynthia looked up at him, and her expression was so complex, anger and fear and something else. Something that might have been pride fighting its way through the terror. "Oh, my love," she said. "What have you done?" This is where everything explodes, where one boy's truth becomes a wildfire that money and power can't control. What Cynthia didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting in that small office trying to figure out how to salvage her life, was that the friendly crew member had already uploaded the clip. Not to the main news feed, not yet, but to the KBS online platform, to their social media, tagged as "Unfiltered Perspective from tonight's charity gala." The video was barely 3 minutes long. It showed a small, serious boy speaking with devastating honesty about cruelty and injustice. It showed his eyes filling with tears when he talked about his mother crying. It showed him saying, with perfect clarity, and that the world should be fair. The first shares happened within 10 minutes. Someone from the hotel staff saw it, sent it to their friends with a message about how crazy it was. One of those friends was a journalist for a competing network. Another was a social media influencer with 200,000 followers. By the time Park Jin-woo took the stage in the main ballroom to announce his new initiative, a program called Technology for Tomorrow's Children that would bring computer education to underprivileged communities, the video had been shared 4,000 times. As he spoke about his commitment to equality and opportunity, about his belief that every child deserves a chance regardless of their background, the view count passed 50,000. When he finished to thunderous applause, standing over man with his arms raised in that practiced gesture of humble gratitude, the hashtag #YouthTruthBomb was trending on Korean Twitter. Cynthia, monitoring her phone with growing horror from the back of the ballroom, watched her life unravel in real time. Messages started coming in from other domestic workers she knew, friends from Ghana, even former colleagues from before she took the park position. "Is this real?" they asked. "Is this really your son?" She wanted to run, to grab Valour and disappear, but she was trapped by duty and fear. She had tasks to complete, items to manage. Mrs. Park kept calling her over, oblivious to the growing storm, asking about coat check and car services and 100 other details that suddenly seemed absurd in their insignificance. It wasn't until the event was winding down, guests beginning to filter out, that Cynthia saw the shift. People were looking at their phones with odd expressions. Small groups formed, whispering urgently. She saw one of Park Jin-woo's assistants rush over to him, show him something on a screen. Saw his face, that benevolent mask, crack for just a moment into something ugly before he controlled it again. Across the ballroom, his eyes found hers. Even at a distance, she could feel the rage in that look. He knew. Somehow, he knew. Mrs. Park appeared at Cynthia's elbow, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "What have you done?" she hissed. "What have you done to this family?" I don't," Cynthia stammered. "Your son. That video. It's everywhere. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "It wasn't me. He's just a child. He didn't mean—" "Get out," Mrs. Park said, her voice shaking with fury. "Get out of this hotel. Get out of our lives. You're fired. And when we're done with you, you'll never work in this city again. You'll never work in this country again." Cynthia felt the words like physical blows. She'd known this was coming, had felt it approaching like a storm, but the reality still staggered her. 7 years of swallowed pride, of endured cruelty, all to keep this job, and now it was gone in an instant. "Please," she tried one more time. "Please, I need this job. My son needs—" "Your son should have thought of that before he lied on camera," Mrs. Park spat. "Spreading vicious rumors about this family, about my husband who has only ever been generous to you people. We should sue you. We should have you deported." "They weren't lies," Cynthia said quietly. The words surprised her, coming from some deep place she usually kept locked down. "Nothing he said was a lie." Mrs. Park's face contorted. "How dare you? How dare you speak to me like that?" "Security," she called out, turning. "Security! Escort this woman out!" But before security could arrive, someone else did. The reporter from earlier, the one in the red dress, approached with her camera crew. "Mrs. Park," she called out. "Mrs. Park, can we get a statement about the allegations made against your family?" Mrs. Park's expression smoothed instantly into cool disdain. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Now please, this is a private event." The video of the young boy, the son of your employee, describing mistreatment and abuse, it's gone viral. Millions of views. Can you respond to these accusations? Around them, phones came out. Other guests were filming now, smelling scandal. Mrs. Park looked around, realizing she was trapped. Her husband appeared beside her, his hand on her arm, his face arranged into an expression of confused concern. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Park Jin-woo said smoothly, his voice carrying that practiced warmth. We employ many people, treat all our staff with respect and fair compensation. If there's been some communication issue, we're certainly willing to address it. But making wild accusations at a charity event seems, well, suspicious in its timing, don't you think? So you deny mistreating your domestic staff? The reporter pressed. I deny nothing because there's nothing to deny, Park Jin-woo said. I'm a businessman, a philanthropist. I dedicate my life to helping others. These kinds of baseless attacks, they're unfortunate but not unexpected when you achieve a certain level of success. People see an opportunity to take advantage. He was good, Cynthia thought distantly. He was very good at this. Already he was flipping the narrative, making himself the victim, making Valour's truth sound like an opportunistic lie. And you, the reporter turned to Cynthia. You're the mother of the boy in the video. Do you stand by what he said? This was it. The moment where she could retreat, apologize, try to salvage something from the wreckage. Or she could do what Valour had done. She could tell the truth. Cynthia looked at Park Jin-woo, at Mrs. Park, at the gathering crowd of wealthy people in expensive clothes. She thought about 7 years of making herself small. She thought about her son's voice on that video saying the world should be fair. Yes, she said clearly. Every word he said was true. The reporter's eyes lit up, the cameras focused in, and Cynthia began to talk. The words came out of Cynthia like water breaking through a dam, unstoppable once started. She spoke about the docked pay, the verbal abuse, the way Halmoni Park threw objects at her. She talked about the children's cruelty and Mrs. Park's systematic humiliation, the way she was inspected like property, the comments about her African heritage that ranged from crude to disgusting. She described the performance the family put on for public events versus the reality behind closed doors. Park Jin-woo tried to interrupt several times, his voice rising with practiced indignation, but the reporter ignored him. Her camera fixed on Cynthia, on the tears streaming down her face, on the way her voice shook but didn't stop. Other staff members began to emerge from the shadows of the ballroom, drawn by the commotion. A Filipino housekeeper from another wealthy family, a Vietnamese gardener, a Chinese driver who'd been let go from a prominent company 6 months ago. They stood in a loose semicircle around Cynthia, and one by one they began to add their voices. It's true, the Filipino woman said. They treat us like we're less than human. My employer made me sleep in a storage closet, the Vietnamese gardener said. When I complained, they fired me. The wealthy families, they think our suffering is invisible, the Chinese driver said. But it's not. The crowd around them grew. Some guests left quickly, me sensing the scandal was about to become unavoidable. Others stayed, filming on their phones, unable to look away from the spectacle of servants becoming humans, of the invisible becoming visible in the most uncomfortable way possible. Park Jin-woo pushed through to the center of the gathering, his face now fully red, the benevolent mask abandoned. This is ridiculous, he thundered. These people are bitter former employees, lashing out because they were terminated for poor performance. Do you think I would allow abuse in my household? Do you know how many inspections we pass? How many regulations we follow? This is defamation. We're being defamed. Then investigate, someone shouted from the crowd. If there's nothing to hide, why be afraid of investigation? The reporter seized on this. Mr. Park, will you consent to a full investigation of your household practices? Park Jin-woo opened his mouth, closed it. For just a moment, a flash of something crossed his face, something that looked like fear. Then he recovered. Of course I'm willing to cooperate with any legitimate inquiry, he said smoothly. I have nothing to hide, but I also won't stand here and be attacked by people trying to make names for themselves by defaming successful people. But the narrative had already shifted. In the ballroom, on social media, in the whispers that would become articles by morning, the story had transformed. This wasn't about one boy's accidental revelation anymore. This was about a system, a culture of exploitation hidden behind the facades of wealth and philanthropy. Mrs. Park had disappeared at some point during Cynthia's testimony, is swept away by her security detail. But Park Jin-woo remained, trapped by his own need to control the situation, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his carefully constructed image. Security finally arrived to disperse the crowd, but by then, the damage was done. The video of Valour had been shared over 500,000 times. News networks were already running stories with headlines like Park Jin-woo's double life and The Dark Side of Seoul's favorite philanthropist. Cynthia was escorted out of the hotel, not by security but by the reporter and her crew, who wanted an on-camera interview while the story was fresh. She agreed, numb with adrenaline and terror and something that felt dangerously like freedom. She answered questions about her employment history, her qualifications, when the gap between what she was capable of and what she was allowed to be. Her master's degree in business administration, her fluency in 4 languages, 7 years of serving tea and cleaning floors and swallowing cruelty, all because no one in Seoul would hire her for what she was actually worth. Valour sat in the back of the news van while his mother spoke to the cameras. He couldn't hear the words clearly, but he could see her face. He'd never seen her look like that before, so fierce and bright, like a warrior finally allowed to fight back. The next 72 hours were a hurricane. The Ministry of Employment and Labor announced an immediate investigation into Daehan Tech Industries' household staff practices. Other wealthy families scrambled to check their own treatment of domestic workers, terrified they might be next. News outlets sent reporters to interview former Park household employees, and they came forward in waves, sharing stories of wage theft and verbal abuse and worse. A Filipino woman named Corazon, who'd worked for the Parks 5 years ago, described how Mrs. Park had locked her out of the house during winter when she complained about not being given enough blankets. A Korean man who'd worked as a driver said Park Jin-woo had once struck him for taking a wrong turn. A Nepalese woman who'd cleaned the house before Cynthia said she'd been forced to work 18-hour days with no overtime pay. The Daehan Tech board of directors called an emergency meeting. Investors began pulling out of deals. The stock price plummeted. Former business partners issued distancing statements. The Technology for Tomorrow's Children initiative that Park Jin-woo had unveiled at the fundraiser was suddenly radioactive, with the government officials who'd attended suddenly remembering they had urgent prior engagements. Park Jin-woo held a press conference trying to regain control. He stood before cameras with his family beside him, all of them wearing expressions of wounded dignity. He announced that he was launching his own investigation, that he would prove these allegations were fabrications by jealous former employees. But the tide had turned too strongly. When the Labor Ministry released their preliminary findings, showing multiple violations of employment standards in the Park household, including failure to provide adequate rest periods and evidence of discriminatory treatment based on nationality, even Park's most loyal defenders began to fall silent. Mrs. Park's mother, Halmoni Park, was identified as the source of several particularly egregious incidents. Security camera footage, obtained through legal channels, showed her throwing objects at staff members on multiple occasions. The elderly woman's lawyer issued a statement saying she was unavailable for comment due to health concerns. The Park children, Min Jun and his older brother, found their social media flooded with criticism. They had attended elite schools, children of privilege, but now they were learning what it meant to be judged. Their classmates' parents began questioning whether the Parks were appropriate role models for youth organizations and volunteer programs the boys were involved in. But it was Valour's interview. The second one the reporter conducted with Cynthia. That became the story's emotional center. The reporter had asked to speak with Valour again, and this time, his mother agreed. He sat beside her on a bench in a small park near their apartment, and he talked about why he'd spoken up. "Because my mom is the best mom," he said, his small voice carrying enormous weight. She works so hard and she never complains at home, but I know she hurts. And that man pretends to be good, but he's not. He should be honest like I was. Then maybe people would really help because they'd know who he really is. The clip was shared millions of times across Asia, then the world, translated into dozens of languages. Valour's face, his mother's protective arm around his shoulders, Dear became an image that seemed to capture something essential about truth and courage and the lies we tell ourselves about power. Other domestic workers began organizing. They formed a support network, sharing resources and legal advice. Foreign workers in Seoul, long isolated and vulnerable, found community with each other. A lawyer named Ji Yeon, who specialized in labor rights, reached out to Cynthia, offering to help her and others seek compensation and justice. You could have stayed silent, Ji Yeon said during their first meeting in a small office that smelled of old coffee. You could have tried to make peace, find another private household position. Why didn't you? Cynthia thought about this question. She thought about Valour's face when he talked about her being the best mom, about the way he'd stood up to cameras and microphones with a courage she hadn't known he possessed. Because my son showed me something, she said finally. He showed me that staying silent doesn't protect you. It just lets them keep hurting you. At least this way, it means something. It might help someone else. Ji-yeon smiled. I have a friend who works for a company called Greenbridge Technologies. They're a startup, focusing on sustainable energy solutions. They need someone with business administration experience, someone who can manage operations and handle international partnerships, someone smart and brave who won't be intimidated by challenges. She slid a paper across the desk. They're hiring. Cynthia looked at the paper, at the job description. It was everything she was qualified for, everything she'd been denied for 7 years. Why would they hire someone like me? Someone who's just become the face of a scandal? Because you're exactly who they need, Ji-yeon said. Someone who isn't afraid to speak truth to power. Someone who's proven they can survive difficult circumstances. And someone who will work twice as hard to prove the world wrong about underestimating you. The interview process was grueling but different from anything Cynthia had experienced before. The company's CEO, a woman named Min Soo who was only 35 and had built Greenbridge from nothing, asked about Cynthia's MBA, about her language skills, about her experience managing complex household operations. Can you handle the pressure of working in a corporate environment? Min Soo asked. The long hours, the fast pace, like the expectations? I spent 7 years working for Park Jin-woo, Cynthia said simply. I can handle anything. Min Soo laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. I watched your interviews. Your son is something else, by the way. That kid has more courage than most adults I know. He's learning from the best, Cynthia said, and for the first time in months, she smiled. She got the job. The salary was good and came with benefits. With respect. With the dignity of work that matched her capabilities. When she told Mrs. Kim next door, the elderly woman actually cried with happiness. When she told her friends from the domestic workers support group, they celebrated like she'd won the lottery. Because in a way, she had. Her first day at Greenbridge Technologies was 3 weeks after the scandal broke. By then, and the initial firestorm had settled into ongoing investigation and legal proceedings. Park Jin-woo faced multiple lawsuits from former employees. The Daehan Tech board had forced his resignation as CEO, though he remained a major shareholder. Mrs. Park had retreated from public life entirely, and the children's schools had requested they take some time away from classes. Cynthia walked into Greenbridge's small but growing office in Mapo-gu, wearing professional clothes she'd bought specifically for this moment, and she felt like she was stepping into a different life. Which, in a way, she was. Her role was operations manager, overseeing the company's supply chain and international partnerships. It was exactly what she'd trained for. exactly what she dreamed of before survival became her only focus. The work was challenging, demanding, often overwhelming, but it was also fulfilling in a way that cleaning mansions and serving meals could never be. Valor's school reached out too. His teacher, Miss Yoon, had watched the news coverage with interest. She'd noticed how Valour had become something of a celebrity among his classmates, some supportive, others teasing. But Miss Yoon saw something else. She saw a child who needed to understand that his actions had consequences, both good and complicated. She invited Cynthia to speak to the class about her experiences. It was difficult, standing before a room full of 8 and 9-year-olds, trying to explain exploitation and injustice in terms they could understand. But Valor sat in the front row, nodding along, proud of his mother in a way that made her heart ache with love. The investigation into the Park household concluded 6 months later. The findings were damning. Multiple violations of labor law, evidence of systematic discrimination based on nationality, documentation of verbal abuse and emotional mistreatment. The Parks were fined heavily, though their wealth meant the financial impact was more symbolic than painful. But the real damage was to their reputation. Park Jin-woo, once a regular fixture in magazine profiles about generous philanthropists and successful businessmen, found himself persona non grata in the circles he'd once dominated. His charitable foundation was dissolved. His speaking engagements dried up. The grand plans for Daehantek's expansion into new markets were abandoned as partners fled. Mrs. Park emerged occasionally, but the social invitations stopped. Dean the Parks, who had hosted the most exclusive parties in Seoul, found themselves uninvited from parties they'd once considered beneath them. It was a fall from grace that fascinated and delighted the public, who loved nothing more than watching the mighty stumble. Cynthia followed the news about the Parks with complicated feelings. She felt satisfaction at their comeuppance, but also a lingering sadness. Not for them, but for herself. For the years she'd lost, for the person she'd been forced to become to survive their cruelty. She wondered sometimes if she would ever fully recover, if the habits of invisibility and deference could ever be unlearned. But then Valour would come home from school with a drawing he'd made, or a good grade on a test, or a story about standing up to a bully who'd been teasing a younger student. And she would remember that her sacrifice had been worth it. Her survival had been worth it. One evening, about a year after the fundraiser, Cynthia came home to find Valour watching television. He was 7 now, actually 8, but still small for his age, curled up on the sofa with a bowl of popcorn. He looked up when she entered, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Mama, come look, they're talking about you again." She sat beside him and saw a documentary on a cable news channel. It was about labor rights for foreign workers in Korea, and it featured an interview with Cynthia, recorded months ago, but airing now. She watched herself on screen, older footage from her Greenbridge days, talking about the importance of treating all workers with dignity regardless of their background. And then Valor's face appeared on the screen, and that same serious expression from the hotel hallway, those same eyes that were hers, but also something more. "I think everyone should be treated fairly," his younger self said. "Even people who work for rich people, especially them, actually, because rich people can be really mean." Valor giggled at himself on television. "I looked so little there," he said, "and my hair was so messy." "You were beautiful," Cynthia said, pulling him close. "You still are." "Thanks, Mama," he said, leaning into her hug. "Are you happy now? Really happy?" Cynthia thought about this. She thought about her job, which she loved, about her apartment, which was small but warm, about her son, who was growing into someone remarkable. She thought about the nights she no longer spent dreading the next day, and the mornings she no longer woke up with her stomach in knots. "Yes," she said, "I'm really happy." Park Jin-woo, in his own penthouse far across the city, also watched the documentary. But his expression was not happy. It was twisted with a mixture of resentment and defeat. He had tried everything to rebuild his image: lawsuits against news organizations, interviews where he played the victim, even a book about overcoming adversity, though publishers had rejected it. But the world had moved on, and Park Jin-woo had been left behind. His wealth remained, of course, obscene amounts of money that would allow him and his family to live comfortably for generations. But his power, his influence, his ability to make others bend to his will, that was gone, shattered by the words of a child who didn't know enough to be afraid. His wife slept in a separate bedroom now. His children attended school abroad, sent away to escape the whispers. His mother had passed away, bitter and unrepentant to the end. And Park Jin-woo sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of wealth, and wondered where it had all gone wrong. He knew the answer, of course. He just couldn't admit it. It had gone wrong when he decided that other people, people who served him, people who cleaned his floors and prepared his food and drove his cars, were somehow less than human. It had gone wrong when he forgot that every person deserves basic respect, regardless of their job or their passport or the color of their skin. It had gone wrong when he became so accustomed to power that he forgot it was borrowed, always borrowed, and could be revoked at any moment by the simple act of someone finding their voice. But Park Jin-woo would never learn this lesson. Some people never do. Cynthia learned it, though. Valour learned it. And every person who watched that small boy's face on their phone screen, who shared his words with friends and family, who felt that inexplicable tightening in their chest when he talked about his mother crying, they learned it too. Truth has a power that wealth can never buy. Courage has a reach that influence can never match. And sometimes, the most profound changes in the world start with the simplest words spoken by a child who doesn't yet know enough to be silenced. "My mom is the best mom," Valour had said. And in those 4 words, he had summarized everything that mattered. Every struggle, every sacrifice. Every night, Cynthia had come home exhausted and still found the strength to read him stories. He had distilled their love into a sentence that millions of people recognized because it was universal. Because every child believes their mother is the best, and every mother wants to believe it too. The documentary ended with footage of Cynthia at work, leading a team meeting at Greenbridge, her voice confident and clear. Then it cut to Valour in his school uniform, waving at the camera as he walked home with friends. "Life goes on," the narrator said, "and sometimes life goes on better than before." Cynthia turned off the television. Valour was already asleep beside her, worn out from a day of school and play. She lifted him carefully, carried him to his bedroom, tucked him into sheets that were getting too short for his growing frame. She stood for a moment in the doorway, watching him sleep. The nightlight cast soft shadows across his face, and she thought about that night at the fundraiser, about the terror she'd felt when she first saw him standing in front of those cameras. But also about pride. That impossible, overwhelming pride that had surfaced despite the fear. She had raised a good son, a brave son, a son who saw wrong and couldn't stay silent, who spoke truth even when it was terrifying, who reminded the world that the measure of a person isn't in their wealth or their power, but in how they treat those who serve them. As for Cynthia herself, she had found her voice too. It had been buried for 7 years, drowned out by necessity and fear, but it had survived. And now it was louder than ever, speaking not just for herself, but for everyone who had been forced into silence, everyone who had been told their suffering was invisible, everyone who had learned that making yourself small was the only way to survive. She was done being small. Somewhere across the city, Park Jin-woo was waking in his penthouse, alone with his guilt and his resentment. His empire had crumbled, his reputation in ruins, and he would spend the rest of his days trying to rebuild something that could never be rebuilt. But Cynthia didn't think about him anymore. He didn't deserve her thoughts. She thought instead about Valour's smile, about her new job, about the weekend and the pancakes she'd promised. She thought about her friends from the workers' support group, about how they were organizing and supporting each other, about how their voices were finally being heard. She thought about her mother in Ghana, who would be so proud if she could see her daughter now. And she thought about how strange life was, how it could shift so completely in the space of a single evening, how one small boy's honesty could bring down what seemed unshakable, how truth, spoken at the right moment, could be more powerful than all the money and influence in the world. She went back inside, back to work, back to building the life she deserved. And somewhere across town, in a classroom filled with 8-year-olds learning about courage and fairness, Valour was probably telling his friends about how his mom was the strongest person he knew. They were both right. The story of Cynthia and Valour spread around the world in the months that followed, becoming a sort of modern fable about standing up to power. But in Seoul, in their small apartment and their growing community, they were just a mother and son living their lives, no longer invisible, no longer silent, no longer small. And that was enough. That was everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that one person's truth can change the world, please like this video and share it with everyone you know, because stories like this need to be heard. And remember, in the comments below, tell me about a time you or someone you know found the courage to speak truth to power. I read every single comment. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Stories about real people fighting for justice deserve an audience, and we're just getting started with more incredible tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and never underestimate the power of speaking your truth.